The hardest question is never the one someone asks out loud. It is the answer you spend years refusing to say. The lights on the 32nd floor were beginning to disappear one office at a time, leaving only a handful of workstations glowing beneath the quiet hum of fluorescent fixtures. Outside, downtown Chicago shimmered beneath a cool autumn sky as thousands of headlights traced slow rivers of white and red between towering glass buildings. Ethan Walker leaned back in his chair and rubbed the bridge of his nose before closing the final project report of the day. It was almost 8:30 in the evening, and the cleaning crew had already started making their way through the nearly empty office. He glanced at the framed photograph sitting beside his computer. His 9-year-old son, Noah, smiled proudly while holding a homemade birdhouse they had built together one Saturday afternoon. Ethan smiled back without realizing it. Every late night at the office carried the same silent calculation. Another 30 minutes here meant 30 fewer minutes reading bedtime stories. Another finished report meant another paycheck keeping promises he had made years ago. He shut down his computer, slipped the photograph carefully into his leather messenger bag, and stood. As he walked toward the elevator, he noticed a light still glowing inside the executive conference room. Victoria Hayes stood alone beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, her reflection blending with the skyline behind her. As chief executive officer, she was known for making difficult decisions with calm confidence, yet tonight her posture seemed unusually tired. She held a coffee mug that had long since gone cold while reviewing a stack of financial reports she no longer appeared to be reading. Hearing footsteps, she looked up and offered a gentle smile. "Working late again?" Ethan returned the smile politely. "Looks like I am not the only one." She laughed quietly. "Fair enough." For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward, filled only by the distant sound of elevators traveling through the building and the faint rhythm of rain beginning to tap against the windows. Victoria had worked with Ethan for nearly 6 years. He was dependable, respected by every department, and somehow managed every impossible deadline without ever asking for recognition. Yet when the office gathered for celebrations, he always left early. When coworkers invited him to dinner, he always declined with quiet courtesy. He smiled often, but no one could remember the last time they had seen him truly relaxed. Victoria had noticed all of it, though she had never asked why. Until tonight. She set her coffee mug on the conference table and folded her arms gently. "Can I ask you something personal?" Ethan paused beside the doorway. "You can ask." She hesitated just long enough to wonder if she should remain silent. Then she quietly said, "Why are you always so alone?" The question drifted through the room more softly than the rain outside, yet it landed with unexpected weight. Ethan looked toward the city lights beyond the glass instead of answering immediately. For one brief moment, a sentence rose inside him with startling clarity. "Because of you." The words reached the edge of his lips before years of discipline gently pulled them back into silence. He lowered his eyes, took a slow breath, and smiled with the same calm expression he offered every difficult day. "Life gets busy," he answered simply. Victoria searched his face as though she knew the truth had been much larger than the sentence he had chosen to speak. Ethan wished her a good evening and stepped into the hallway, the elevator doors closing quietly behind him. As the elevator descended floor by floor, he watched his own reflection in the polished steel doors and wondered why, after so many years, that one question still had the power to reopen a chapter of his life he believed he had already forgiven. The cool night air greeted Ethan as he stepped out of the office building and into the glow of downtown streetlights reflecting across rain-soaked sidewalks. Chicago never truly seemed to sleep. Taxis rolled through busy intersections, commuters hurried toward train platforms, and distant sirens blended into the city's familiar heartbeat. Ethan adjusted the strap of his messenger bag and checked the time on his watch. It was almost 9 o'clock. Noah would probably still be awake. His son always tried to stay awake until he heard the front door open, even after Ethan reminded him every night that growing boys needed sleep. 25 minutes later, Ethan quietly unlocked the front door of the small brick townhouse they had called home for nearly 7 years. Before he could switch on the hallway light, a cheerful voice echoed from the living room. "I knew you were coming." Ethan smiled as Noah hurried toward him wearing dinosaur pajamas and thick wool socks that slid slightly across the hardwood floor. "You should have been asleep 30 minutes ago," Ethan said, gently ruffling his son's hair. Noah grinned without guilt. "I tried. Then I remembered we still have to finish building the model airplane." Ethan laughed softly. "You drive a hard bargain." The smell of tomato soup lingered in the kitchen beside 2 grilled cheese sandwiches carefully wrapped in foil. A handwritten note rested beside the plate. Mrs. Alvarez from next door had stopped by again. The note simply read, "Heat before eating. Noah already finished his vegetables. You are welcome." Ethan looked toward the shared wall separating the 2 homes and smiled with quiet gratitude. Kindness often arrived without making any noise. While the soup warmed on the stove, Noah spread tiny plastic airplane pieces across the kitchen table. His small hands carefully searched for the next part while Ethan patiently followed the instruction booklet beside him. "Dad?" Noah asked after several quiet minutes. "Yes? Do you like your job?" Ethan paused before answering. "I do." Noah looked up. "Even though you work late all the time?" Ethan smiled gently. "I like what my job allows me to do." Noah seemed puzzled. Ethan tapped the instruction booklet before looking into his son's eyes. "It lets us build airplanes on Tuesday nights. It lets us keep this house. It lets you play baseball every spring." Noah nodded thoughtfully. "So you do not work because you love work?" Ethan chuckled. "Exactly." After dinner they finished assembling the little red airplane and placed it carefully beside dozens of other handmade projects lining a bookshelf in the living room. Every birdhouse, puzzle, and model represented time Ethan had protected no matter how busy life became. Long after Noah finally drifted asleep, Ethan quietly folded laundry while listening to the gentle rhythm of rain against the windows. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A company email had arrived from Victoria reminding department managers about the annual family appreciation picnic scheduled for Saturday afternoon. Employees were encouraged to bring spouses, children, parents, or anyone important in their lives. Ethan stared at the message for several seconds before placing the phone face down. He had attended every company picnic alone except for the years Noah had been old enough to enjoy them. He never thought much about it until tonight. Victoria's question returned once again, calm and uninvited. "Why are you always so alone?" Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment as memories he had carefully stored away threatened to rise once more. Somewhere inside the quiet house, Noah murmured softly in his sleep. Ethan looked toward his son's bedroom, and the weight inside his heart eased just enough for another tomorrow. What the world called loneliness had long ago become the space where a father quietly kept every promise he had left to give. Saturday morning arrived with clear blue skies stretching above Lincoln Park as families from every department gathered beneath rows of white tents decorated with autumn flowers and company banners. Children laughed while chasing one another across the open field, the scent of grilled hamburgers drifted through the crisp air, and a local band quietly played familiar country songs near the picnic pavilion. Ethan parked his aging sedan beneath a row of maple trees before walking toward the entrance with Noah beside him. His son carried a well-worn baseball glove tucked beneath one arm, his excitement impossible to hide. "Do you think they will have a pitching contest this year?" Noah asked. Ethan smiled. "Knowing this company, I would be disappointed if they did not." As they stepped onto the lawn, co-workers greeted Ethan with genuine warmth. Everyone respected his steady leadership and calm judgment, but many seemed pleasantly surprised to finally meet the young boy whose framed photograph had quietly occupied Ethan's desk for years. Noah shook hands confidently, introduced himself with polite manners, and quickly disappeared toward a group of children organizing a game of catch. Ethan watched until he was certain his son felt comfortable before making his way toward the refreshment tables. From across the lawn, Victoria noticed him almost immediately. She had attended dozens of company gatherings over the years, yet something about seeing Ethan outside the office felt strangely different. Without spreadsheets, deadlines, or conference rooms surrounding him, he seemed lighter somehow. His smile appeared more natural each time Noah laughed nearby. She found herself watching a father instead of an operations manager. So that is Noah, she quietly said to herself. Moments later she walked over carrying 2 cups of fresh coffee. "Good morning," she said warmly. Ethan accepted the cup with grateful surprise. "Thank you." Victoria glanced toward Noah, who had just thrown a perfect catch before celebrating with several other children. "He looks happy." Ethan followed her gaze, and the corners of his eyes softened with unmistakable pride. "He usually is." They stood together beneath the shade of an old oak tree while families filled the park with cheerful conversation. For several quiet moments neither of them spoke. The peaceful atmosphere made silence feel completely natural. Finally Victoria smiled gently. "I have never seen you like this." Ethan looked puzzled. "Like what?" "Relaxed." He laughed quietly. "You only know the version of me that spends 10 hours staring at project schedules." Victoria smiled. "Maybe I have been missing the better version." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, unsure how to respond. Before he could answer, Noah came running toward them carrying a baseball. "Dad, we need one more player." Ethan looked toward Victoria apologetically. "Duty calls." She nodded with an amused smile. "Go." Ethan jogged onto the field without hesitation, and within seconds father and son were laughing together beneath the bright autumn sun. Victoria remained where she was, quietly observing from a distance. She watched Ethan encourage every child, celebrate every successful catch, and patiently comfort one little boy after a missed throw. There was nothing extraordinary about his actions, yet everything about them revealed extraordinary character. It suddenly became impossible to reconcile this gentle, devoted father with the quiet man who spent every workday carefully keeping the world at arm's length. As the game continued, one of the senior employees stepped beside Victoria with a knowing smile. "Hard to believe, is it?" he asked. She turned toward him. "What do you mean?" The older man folded his hands in his jacket pockets. "Most people think Ethan is distant because he prefers being alone." He watched Ethan lift Noah onto his shoulders after the game ended. "The truth is, he has spent years making sure one little boy never has to feel lonely." Victoria looked back across the field, her heart growing unexpectedly heavy. For the first time, she realized she had been asking the wrong question all along. The company picnic ended just before sunset, but Victoria carried its quiet images home long after the last folding chair had been packed away. She could still picture Ethan kneeling beside Noah to retie a loose shoelace before the baseball game, patiently listening to every story his son wanted to tell, and celebrating every small victory as though it were the greatest achievement in the world. Those moments refused to leave her thoughts. On Monday morning, the office returned to its familiar rhythm. Computer screens glowed beneath bright ceiling lights, printers hummed steadily, and meetings filled every conference room. Ethan arrived precisely at 8 o'clock carrying his leather messenger bag and a travel mug of black coffee, greeting everyone with the same quiet kindness he offered every day. Nothing about his routine suggested that anything had changed. Yet for Victoria, everything had. During the weekly executive meeting, department heads discussed quarterly budgets, staffing plans, and expansion proposals. Ethan presented operational updates with his usual calm confidence, answering every question with careful preparation and respectful professionalism. When the meeting ended, several managers hurried toward their next appointments, but Victoria noticed Ethan quietly gathering abandoned notebooks left behind by others before placing them neatly on the conference table. It was such a small gesture that almost no one else noticed it. Somehow, she did. Later that afternoon, Victoria stopped outside the Human Resources office to sign several routine documents. While waiting, she noticed a promotion recommendation resting near the top of a personnel folder. The name immediately caught her attention. Ethan Walker. Curious, she glanced at the summary attached to the file. It showed that during the past 6 years Ethan had been nominated for senior executive positions 3 separate times. 3 separate times he had declined. Victoria looked toward Melissa Grant, the Human Resources Director. "I do not remember this," she said quietly. Melissa smiled knowingly. "Most people do not. Ethan never wanted anyone making a big deal out of it." Victoria looked back at the paperwork. These promotions would have nearly doubled his salary. Melissa nodded. They also required extensive travel. Victoria remained silent. Melissa continued gently. "Each time we asked why he was turning them down, he always gave the same answer." Victoria looked up. "What did he say?" Melissa smiled with quiet admiration. "He said no promotion was worth missing his son's childhood." The word settled heavily inside the quiet office. Victoria slowly closed the folder, her thoughts returning to the baseball field 2 days earlier, to Noah's bright smile, and to Ethan's patient laughter echoing beneath the autumn trees. She suddenly understood that his choices had never been driven by a lack of ambition. They had been guided by something far greater than career success. That evening, as most employees prepared to leave, Victoria noticed Ethan standing alone near the office window watching the first lights appear across the city skyline. She walked over carrying 2 cups of fresh coffee without saying a word. Ethan accepted one with a grateful smile. "Thank you." Victoria looked out across the glowing buildings beside him. "Can I ask you another question?" Ethan chuckled softly. "You have earned that privilege." She hesitated before speaking. "You turn down opportunities most people spend their entire careers chasing." Ethan looked into the warm coffee rising in gentle curls of steam. "Some opportunities only look valuable until they ask you to give up what matters most." Victoria studied his peaceful expression. "Do you ever regret it?" Ethan smiled with quiet certainty and shook his head once. "Not when I hear my son laugh." Victoria lowered her eyes, realizing that the richest man she had ever met was standing beside her wearing an ordinary blue dress shirt, carrying an old messenger bag, and asking nothing from the world except enough time to keep the promises he had made to one little boy. The days that followed passed with quiet consistency, yet something subtle had changed inside Victoria. She found herself noticing details she had somehow overlooked for years. Ethan always arrived before everyone else, not because anyone expected him to, but because he preferred solving problems before they became someone else's burden. He quietly refilled the office coffee machine when it ran empty. He stayed behind to help new employees understand complicated procedures without ever mentioning it to management. He never interrupted meetings, never sought credit, and never left before making certain his team had everything they needed. The more Victoria observed, the more she wondered how someone so remarkable had remained almost invisible in plain sight. One rainy Thursday afternoon she decided to organize decades of archived executive records that had recently been moved into a digital storage room beneath the headquarters. The project was simple enough. She wanted to better understand how the company had evolved before she became chief executive officer. Dust covered old filing cabinets while cardboard boxes lined narrow shelves stretching from floor to ceiling. The room smelled faintly of paper, cedar, and time itself. As Victoria reviewed folders from nearly 10 years earlier, one personnel file slipped from an overfilled box and landed gently on the floor. She bent down to retrieve it. The name on the tab immediately caught her attention. Ethan Walker. Curious, she opened the folder. Inside were performance reviews, promotion recommendations, attendance records, and several administrative documents from the earliest years of Ethan's employment. One page, however, stood apart from the others. It was an emergency transfer authorization approved during a major company restructuring. The document carried a familiar signature. Hers. Victoria frowned slightly. She remembered signing dozens of similar approvals during her first months as interim executive while the company struggled through financial uncertainty. Back then every decision had been measured in minutes rather than days. She continued reading. According to the records, Ethan had been reassigned to supervise an emergency overnight installation for an important client outside the city. Attached behind the authorization was a leave request submitted only hours later. Family medical emergency. The request had been approved, but by then the assignment had already delayed his return home. Victoria's heartbeat slowed. She carefully turned another page and found a brief note from Human Resources explaining that Ethan had returned to work several weeks later after the unexpected passing of his wife following a sudden medical crisis. No blame appeared anywhere in the file. No complaint. No appeal. No accusation. Only quiet documentation marking one of the darkest chapters of a man's life. Victoria slowly lowered the folder onto the table as the silence inside the archive room became almost overwhelming. She stared at her own signature again. She knew she had never intended harm. She had simply signed another document during an exhausting week filled with impossible decisions. Yet she could not escape the painful realization that her signature had unknowingly become part of the timeline Ethan would remember forever. Suddenly his unfinished sentence from that evening in the conference room echoed inside her mind with startling clarity. Because of you. She closed her eyes. He had never spoken those words aloud. He had chosen grace instead. He had spent years treating her with unwavering professionalism despite carrying memories she had never known existed. Victoria gently closed the folder and rested both hands upon it, overcome not by guilt alone but by profound respect. The strongest man she had ever worked beside had every opportunity to become bitter, yet he had chosen to become a better father instead. For the first time since reading the file, Victoria understood that forgiveness sometimes happened long before the person being forgiven ever realized they needed it. The following evening, the city skyline glowed beneath a blanket of silver clouds as the last employees quietly left the office one by one. Victoria remained alone in her office long after the elevators had grown silent, Ethan's personnel file resting neatly on the corner of her desk beside an untouched cup of tea that had long since gone cold. She had reviewed the documents 3 times, hoping she had misunderstood something, yet every page led to the same painful truth. Years earlier, she had unknowingly signed a decision that delayed Ethan during the darkest day of his life. She could not change the past, but she could no longer pretend she had never learned it. Across town, Ethan finished washing the dinner dishes while Noah completed his math homework at the kitchen table. The familiar rhythm of ordinary life surrounded them. Soft jazz drifted from a small radio on the windowsill, warm light filled the little townhouse, and the smell of freshly baked apple muffins lingered in the air after Mrs. Alvarez had stopped by earlier that afternoon with another thoughtful surprise. Ethan smiled as Noah proudly solved the final problem on the page. Finished, the boy announced. I knew you could do it, Ethan replied. Noah looked up with curious eyes. Dad, are you happy? The question caught Ethan off guard. He dried his hands with a kitchen towel before pulling out the chair beside his son. That is a big question. Noah shrugged. My teacher said happy people smile more. Ethan smiled gently. Being happy does not always mean smiling all the time. Sometimes it means knowing the people you love are safe. Noah thought quietly before nodding. Then I think you are happy. Ethan rested a hand on his son's shoulder. I think I am learning to be. At that same moment, Victoria sat inside her car across the street from the townhouse, not because she intended to interrupt their evening but because she had driven there without fully realizing it. She had found the address in the employee directory after leaving the office, hoping only to understand the life Ethan protected so fiercely. Through the softly lit front window she saw a father helping his son clean the dinner table before both of them laughed over something written inside a school notebook. There was no luxury, no grand display of success, only warmth, patience, and quiet love filling every corner of a modest home. Victoria felt tears gather unexpectedly as she realized that Ethan had never allowed his greatest sorrow to become his son's inheritance. The next morning she asked Ethan if he could spare a few minutes after work. He agreed without hesitation. As evening settled over the nearly empty office, they met once again inside the conference room overlooking the city lights where their conversation had begun days earlier. Victoria stood beside the windows with both hands folded, searching for words that suddenly felt far too small. Ethan entered carrying his familiar messenger bag and offered the same respectful smile he always did. "You wanted to see me?" She nodded slowly. "I found an old personnel file yesterday." Ethan's expression remained calm. Before she could continue, he quietly understood which file she meant. A gentle silence settled between them. Finally Victoria spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never knew." Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment before looking back at her with remarkable peace. "I know." She struggled to continue. "If I had known what was happening that day, I would have done everything differently." Ethan gave a small, understanding smile. Holding on to that thought would only punish someone who never intended to cause pain. Victoria looked at him through tear-filled eyes. "How can you say that so calmly?" Ethan glanced toward the glowing skyline beyond the glass. "Because carrying anger home every night would not have made me a better father. Letting it go did." In that quiet room high above the city, Victoria finally understood that forgiveness was not the reward given to those who deserved it. Sometimes it was the gift offered by someone whose strength had been quietly built through years of choosing love over resentment. The conversation ended without another word, yet its quiet weight followed both of them into the days that came after. Nothing dramatic changed at the office. Deadlines still arrived every Friday morning, conference rooms still filled with presentations, and employees still hurried through the hallways carrying laptops and coffee cups. But Victoria began making choices that no one noticed except Ethan. She stopped scheduling late meetings unless absolutely necessary, knowing parents on her staff deserved dinner at home more than another hour around a conference table. She introduced flexible work hours for employees caring for children or aging parents without announcing that one man's example had inspired the policy. She quietly approved additional family leave benefits that had been delayed for years. She never mentioned Ethan's name during those discussions. She simply remembered the little townhouse filled with laughter instead of resentment. Ethan noticed the changes, although he never assumed they had anything to do with him. He simply appreciated that more people now hurried home carrying backpacks, soccer uniforms, and grocery bags instead of unfinished work. One Wednesday evening, as he packed his messenger bag, Victoria stopped beside his desk. "Noah still plays baseball on Wednesdays?" she asked. Ethan nodded with a surprised smile. "Practice starts at 6. Victoria glanced toward the stack of reports waiting for review. "Then those can wait until tomorrow morning." Ethan looked at her for a moment before answering. "Thank you." She smiled gently. "Go be where you are needed most." 40 minutes later the cool autumn air echoed with the sound of baseball striking leather gloves at the neighborhood park. Parents sat along aluminum bleachers, wrapped in light jackets while children chased fly balls beneath tall field lights. Ethan stood near the third base line encouraging Noah after every swing, never raising his voice, never criticizing a mistake, only celebrating effort. As practice continued, Ethan noticed someone unfamiliar standing quietly near the back fence. Victoria wore a simple navy sweater instead of a business suit, holding a paper cup of hot chocolate with both hands. She waved awkwardly when he recognized her. During the break between drills, Noah jogged over with flushed cheeks and an enormous grin. "Dad, who is that?" Ethan smiled. "My boss." Noah looked surprised. She came all the way here. Before Ethan could answer, Victoria approached with a warm smile. I hope I am not interrupting. Ethan shook his head. Not at all. She knelt slightly to meet Noah at eye level. I have heard you are the best second baseman in Chicago. Noah laughed proudly. Maybe not the best. Victoria smiled. The best ones are usually humble. She handed him the hot chocolate. I thought you might be cold after practice. Noah accepted it politely. Thank you, Miss Hayes. As the practice resumed, Victoria stayed only a few more minutes before preparing to leave. I did not come to check on work, she said quietly to Ethan. I came because I realized I have spent years knowing what kind of employee you are without ever learning what kind of father you are. Ethan looked toward Noah chasing another ground ball across the infield. He is the best part of my life. Victoria nodded softly. I can see that. She started walking toward the parking lot, then paused and looked back. Would the two of you join me for dinner this Saturday? Nothing formal. Just dinner. Ethan hesitated, not because he doubted her sincerity, but because accepting kindness had always been harder than offering it. Before he could answer, Noah called across the field with youthful enthusiasm. Dad, tell her yes. I think she is nice. Ethan laughed quietly, and for the first time in many years, saying yes to a new beginning no longer felt like betraying the life he had lost. It simply felt like honoring the one he still had. Saturday evening arrived wrapped in the quiet glow of early winter. Soft lights hung across the entrance of a small family-owned Italian restaurant overlooking the Chicago River, where reflections shimmered gently across the water beneath the city skyline. Ethan parked beside the curb and helped Noah straighten the collar of his blue sweater before the three of them stepped inside. The restaurant was warm with laughter, the comforting aroma of fresh bread and rosemary, and the quiet melody of a piano drifting through the dining room. Victoria greeted them near a corner table with a smile that felt noticeably more relaxed than the confident expression she wore at the office. Tonight there were no executives, no deadlines, and no conference rooms. There were simply three people sharing an ordinary evening that somehow felt extraordinary. Noah quickly discovered that Victoria knew surprisingly detailed facts about airplanes, baseball, and dinosaurs. Every time he asked another question, she answered with genuine curiosity instead of polite obligation. Ethan watched quietly as his son laughed more than he had in weeks. At one point Noah excused himself to wash his hands before dessert arrived, leaving Ethan and Victoria alone for the first time that evening. Neither spoke immediately. Candlelight reflected softly across the polished wooden table while snowflakes drifted beyond the restaurant windows. Finally Victoria smiled gently. Can I ask you something I have been wondering ever since that night in the conference room? Ethan looked at her with calm curiosity. Of course. She folded her hands together. When I asked why you were always alone, you almost answered differently. Ethan looked toward the river outside before slowly nodding. Yes. Victoria waited patiently. What were you going to say? He remained silent for several seconds, not searching for words but deciding whether the truth still belonged to the past. At last he smiled with quiet honesty. For one brief moment, I almost blamed you. Victoria lowered her eyes without interrupting. Ethan continued gently. Not because you meant to hurt me. Because grief searches for someone to point at. It is easier then. Accepting that life sometimes changes without asking permission. Victoria listened without moving. Then what changed, she whispered. Ethan looked toward the empty chair where Noah would soon return. One night I realized that every minute I spent blaming someone was 1 minute I was not giving my son the father he deserved. His voice remained calm, carrying no trace of bitterness. Loneliness is not something another person gives us. Sometimes it grows because we stop letting hope back into our lives. Victoria felt tears gather quietly in her eyes. And now? Ethan smiled softly. Now I think hope has been knocking on my door for a while. I was simply too afraid to answer. Before she could respond, Noah hurried back carrying 3 small spoons for dessert. He looked from Ethan to Victoria and grinned. Did I miss something important? Ethan laughed warmly. Only a very good conversation. The waiter arrived with warm apple pie topped with vanilla ice cream, and Noah insisted everyone share from the same dessert because, in his words, everything tastes better when nobody eats alone. Victoria smiled through grateful eyes as the 3 of them laughed together. Later that evening, Ethan drove home beneath streets dusted with fresh snow while Noah quietly dozed in the back seat, his baseball cap resting against the window. Before stepping out of the car, Ethan noticed a folded note tucked into his coat pocket. Sometime during dinner Victoria had slipped it there without saying a word. He unfolded it beneath the porch light. In neat handwriting it read, "Thank you for teaching me that forgiveness is not forgetting the past. It is choosing not to let the past decide the future." Ethan folded the note carefully and placed it inside his wallet beside Noah's photograph, realizing that some of the most meaningful promises in life are never spoken aloud. They are simply lived, one quiet day at a time. 1 year later, the first Saturday of October welcomed Chicago with crisp air, brilliant maple leaves, and a sky so clear it seemed to promise that every season eventually finds its way back to light. The annual neighborhood harvest festival had become one of Noah's favorite traditions. Booths lined the park with homemade pies, carved pumpkins, warm cider, and local musicians playing familiar songs beneath strings of glowing lights. Children laughed as they raced through hay bale mazes while families gathered around picnic tables wrapped in scarves and light jackets. Ethan stood beside a wooden fence watching Noah compete in a pumpkin decorating contest, his hands tucked comfortably into the pockets of a brown jacket that had become his favorite over the past year. He no longer looked like a man carrying the weight of unfinished chapters. His smile came more easily now, arriving without effort whenever he heard his son's laughter. A familiar voice approached from behind. "I think we have a future artist on our hands." Ethan turned to find Victoria carrying 2 cups of hot apple cider, her cheeks touched by the cool autumn breeze. She handed 1 cup to him before standing beside him without saying another word. Their quiet moments had become one of the simplest and most treasured parts of everyday life. There was no need to fill every silence because both of them had learned that peace often speaks more clearly than conversation ever could. Noah ran toward them holding a bright orange pumpkin decorated with painted blue airplanes flying through white clouds. "Second place," he announced proudly. Ethan knelt and hugged him. "I could not be more proud." Victoria smiled. "I think first place might have been afraid of the competition." Noah laughed before wandering toward another activity with several friends from school. Ethan watched him disappear into the cheerful crowd. "He has grown so much," Victoria said softly. Ethan nodded. "So have I." They walked slowly toward the small pond at the edge of the park where golden leaves floated gently across the water. The same city that once felt filled with long workdays and quiet loneliness now seemed full of ordinary blessings he had almost forgotten were possible. Victoria stopped beside the wooden footbridge and looked at Ethan with a familiar warmth in her eyes. "Can I ask you one more question?" He smiled. "You always ask the important ones." She laughed quietly before speaking. "Do you remember the question I asked you in the conference room that evening?" Ethan nodded immediately. "I remember every word." She looked toward the calm water before meeting his eyes again. "So tell me honestly." Her voice was almost a whisper. "Are you still lonely?" Ethan looked across the park where Noah waved enthusiastically while showing his pumpkin to Mrs. Alvarez, who applauded as proudly as any grandmother would have. He looked back at Victoria, whose kindness had never tried to replace his past but had patiently helped him build a future. Then he gently reached for her hand. "Not anymore," he answered with a peaceful smile. "I finally learned that loneliness is not healed by forgetting yesterday. It is healed by having someone willing to walk beside you tomorrow." Victoria's eyes filled with grateful tears, but this time they were tears born from hope rather than regret. She squeezed his hand gently as church bells echoed somewhere beyond the park and autumn leaves drifted quietly around them. Noah came running back and instinctively reached for both of their hands, smiling as though this had always been the way life was meant to be. The three of them continued walking beneath the golden trees while the afternoon sun settled gently over the city. Looking at the family beside him, Ethan realized the answer he had almost spoken 1 year earlier no longer belonged to his story. Blame had surrendered to forgiveness. Grief had made room for gratitude. The quiet strength that had carried him through his darkest years had not only protected his son. It had quietly opened the door to a second chance neither of them had expected. Sometimes the greatest victory is not proving someone wrong. Sometimes it is refusing to let pain write the final chapter, because dignity remains strongest when it chooses grace, and love grows deepest when it begins with forgiveness.